All right, Mr. Maimane, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I just want us to start with, of course, the event that's happening on Freedom Day. You'll be going to attend the Anti-Zuma March rally. Tell me about that and what you're hoping to achieve with that.
It's important that when we talk about freedom, we remind ourselves that our freedoms are under threat. We remind ourselves that, in fact, whilst we've made progress, we need to not allow the state to be captured by a few. And so today there's an event of all South Africans from all sectors of society, labor, business, political parties, religious communities, gathering together at the Caledonian and standing up for that cause to say, yes, we can remove Jacob Zuma, but we should dare never forget that we've got to safeguard the Constitution. We've got to fight for our hard-won freedoms. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and the reason I asked what are these marches going to achieve is because you've taken part in other marches, and that the president has made it clear that he's not leaving office until his term finishes. And though divided, the ANC has actually backed him. So what sort of are you trying to see happen? Are you hoping that the president will finally feel the pressure and finally step down?
You know, at the end of the day, all leadership always is about people. You don't lead in a vacuum, you lead South Africans. And when you have a leader like Jacob Zuma who is fast losing the leadership of society, it stops becoming a matter of how often the ANC can defend him. It in fact says that whilst they can pretend you've got a head of state who has the mandate of the people have long moved away. And so in part, these marches are a clear demonstration for me that South Africans are taking a stance, they disagree with what's happening. But also, it is about understanding that you are right. The ANC has defended Jacob Zuma. So how do we collectively make sure that they will be removed come 2019? Because if you don't do that, the conversation we must have now is what South Africa do we want to see post the ANC? That's the conversation we ought to be having. Because I think it's now a foregone conclusion that the ANC invests all of its energy defending criminality.
Another way you want to get rid of the president is through a motion of no confidence against him. And I think this will be the fifth one that's coming, if I'm not mistaken. And the previous ones have failed, and possibly because you failed to sort of incite more ANC MPs to vote in support of it. What gives you hope that this coming one will succeed? Are you hoping that the possible secret ballot will sort of move and allow some ANC MPs to vote in support of this?
I think the only way we can also see the secret ballot is because in the world where many of the ANC MPs have been threatened and lives have been put in danger, then I think it's worthwhile having a conversation about a secret ballot. But I think broadly speaking, we must ask honorable men to do honorable things and be able to stand up boldly so and pronounce that I will take a stance against Jacob Zuma. The motions of no confidence are an important tool in our constitution because many people say the president must be removed by Luthuli House, but he's not appointed by Luthuli House. He's appointed by Parliament itself. So we must make sure the institution of Parliament works to safeguard the constitution, to ensure that the president is held to account, and we will not deter. Even if we were to bring many more, the facts on the table are you must keep, for South Africans to understand that we believe fundamentally Jacob Zuma is unfit to be president and should be removed.
And speaking of the secret ballot, I remember you've previously said, urged ANC MPs to vote according to their conscience, and I remember the EFF had actually started a process where they said they were consulting with some ANC MPs to support this motion of no confidence. I don't know if you were part of those discussions as well, but are you getting a sense that some ANC MPs actually want to vote in support of this motion of no confidence?
Without doubt. I mean, I think publicly, already the SACP has already come out with a strong stance against the president. Already, even as we prepare towards Workers' Day, some of the union members are saying they don't want the president to come and speak at a Workers' Day. Imagine a structure of the party saying, we don't want the president to come and speak here. Now, we have had conversations with people internally within the ANC, and many of them are saying, we'll be willing to do this thing. But obviously, for many of them, they fear for their lives, etc. But even if it was a few, you can recall the last motion of no confidence, there were MPs who stayed away deliberately. So you build the momentum as you discuss it with them and say, how many honorable people can you find in this organization? If none, then we are not going to be deterred. This is not about the ANC, this is about South Africa. And if the ANC wants to collectively defend Jacob Zuma, well, we must move on.
And it seems the DA then wants the ANC MPs to sort of be free agents and vote according to their conscience, and that would disregard their deployment contract. Would the DA allow this?
This is a matter of principle. This is a matter of a free vote. That's why I call it the question of consciousness. Because when you get into that, this is not a debate about policy. There is no ways if the ANC went to the electorate or the DA went to the electorate and said, this is our manifesto. We want to do things in a particular way. And an MP came to Parliament and voted against that. Now, that means they are not standing for the party. That fundamentally breaks that down. This, on the other hand, is about a leader who has been found to have violated the Constitution, is facing 700 charges of corruption, is ultimately misleading Parliament and misleading his own party. So it's not a policy. You can't have a policy to defend a criminal. You've got to get to a point where you say, now is a question of voting. And I actually think it's even just beyond consciousness. It's about doing the right thing. It's about saying, what would South Africans, my kids would look at me one day and say, how did you protect someone who broke the Constitution and violated South Africa? And you know, in many African states, they come and they have a discussion with me about the very issues that we are starting to grapple with now. They have seen in other African states. And therefore you create these dictators who capture democracy, who capture parliament, work their way towards capturing the judiciary, and you end up with a democracy that simply is unworkable. And I think we as South Africans need to be ahead, and we need to be able to say we take heed of the warnings that are coming. We want a constitutional democracy. We want a non-racial South Africa. And people who are standing in the way of that must be removed.
And if it's the DA, perhaps there's a leader in the DA that is accused of violating the Constitution, how would the DA deal with this? And I ask this because the party sort of regards the breaking of ranks, and I see in their constitution, the section 3.5 of the DA constitution, it provides that a member ceases to be a member of the party when he or she, being a public representative of the party in a legislative body, in any meeting of that legislative body, votes in a manner other than in accordance with the party caucus decision. So it seems as though by breaking ranks, it's nothing less than a capital offense that automatically leads to expulsion.
But you see, when there is someone who commits a criminal offense, caucuses could not be able to caucus and make a decision around that. And that provision came on board to say, as a party, we have a structure nationally that ensures that when we operate, we take particular decisions. We take particular actions. We as a party would never defend criminality. We'd never put policies that in fact would harm the people of South Africa and ask caucuses to execute against that. That provision came on board because when you are running a government, you want governments that are stable, and you don't want people who are coming in there to continually be fighting internal battles using legislative structures. Having said that, if I, Mmusi Maimane, or any leader of the DA, did what Jacob Zuma must do, it would be incumbent upon either the leader themselves to step down, or that in fact we would remove that leader. And we certainly as a party would not tolerate somebody who violates the Constitution and acts in a manner that Jacob Zuma has.
Do you think there's a need to also perhaps change that constitution of the DA to make it very clear that if the leader or any member or leader of the party faces or has violated the Constitution, then in that manner, DA MPs are allowed to vote against the caucus decision?
But you don't view the constitution of the party in isolation. You don't read that clause in isolation. That clause forms part of many clauses that also stops members of parliament. Because before you are any leader, you are anything, in a caucus, in a legislature, you are elected there. So if you fail, there are clauses that say if you don't even meet the required standards of delivery for the people, if you act in a manner that is criminal, if you commit criminal acts, all of those matters are in place that your membership would cease anyways. So it would never arise to a point where you had to say to yourself, you must vote on it. But if the need then did arise, then of course, the structure and the organization would ensure that it gives the members the right to do so.
Yeah. So the DA has been gaining ground in recent years. I mean, the ANC has lost key metros to the DA-led coalition. And I remember after you were elected DA leader in 2015, you said your predecessor, Helen Zille, has managed to bring the DA to be the main opposition, and your key focus would be to take this party and make it the party of national government. And I know you were involved in a roadshow as well. Take us through that, and how do you plan on achieving this goal when the DA is still a party with less than 30% of the national vote?
Well, many people said that when we set our sights in Tshwane, they said that when we looked at Nelson Mandela Bay, etc. Because you must recall, now we are in a terrain where when I look, I say no party in 2019 is going to get above 50%. Which means the future of South Africa is coalitions anyways. It's not just... In fact, I think even the ANC's policy documents are trying to instruct their members to figure out how to work with coalitions. So that's the first objective. The second one is, how do we go into communities, particularly where we govern, to say, how do we engage more South Africans? And for me, the thing that's most exciting about the DA is that it's the only party that can grow in Ngutu as well as it can in Sandton, as well as it can in any other community. We're the only party that represents all races in South Africa. We're the only party where we govern, life in fact materially gets better for the people of South Africa. And based on evidence even from the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, indicate that DA municipalities are the best run in the country. So against that backdrop, we have to be the party of government that builds a capable state. We have to maintain the view that we're a non-racial party. We have to advance the idea of economic advancement because we want more South Africans to be included in the economy. I'm dissatisfied personally about the state of our economy. I think it benefits a few. There are many at the expense who are unemployed, and so we need a complete change on that space. And we need to come to a point where we say, how do we build an economy that is inclusive, particularly of South Africans who are left behind, in the main, black South Africans. And that requires all of us working together to achieve that invitation and make sure that we not only set up funds that are able to invest in development, we don't only ensure that we invest in micro-enterprise, we don't only ensure that we liberalize key industries so that you can have better trade and exports, that you deal decisively with an economic empowerment of South Africans so that more people are owners in the economy. That's the destiny.
Prince Mashele, a political analyst, is predicting that in 2019, you will go into a coalition with mainly the EFF and other opposition parties, and that you will be the president with Julius Malema as your deputy. Is this possible?
What I envisage happening in 2019 is that we have to sit down post that in a world where we've got to talk about coalitions and say, what are the things we can do in the 5-year term? Because government requires to deliver. There's an urgency in South Africa. We've already been rated junk status. More South Africans are losing their work. So what are the 4 or 5 things that we need to do? And I think we've got to say, how do we safeguard the Constitution? How do we root out corruption? How do we maintain non-racialism? How do we ensure that we can invest in infrastructure so that our growth isn't just consumption-led but infrastructure-driven? And how do we ensure that key industries like agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, mining are able to compete in an export market? And how do we educate South Africans so that we create the best labor that can compete with anybody in the world? On the basis of those 5 or 6 things, can you then sit down with South Africans who share those values and say, let's come together, and if you agree, let's work a government program that achieves in those first 5 years? And then in that case, it's not a matter of saying, this party, that one. It's a matter of saying, here's a government that has set some very strong objectives, and it pursues to achieve them. And therefore, there might be South Africans from a wide range of spectrum. In fact, that's how we even negotiated the local government elections. We said to ourselves, how do we come around in a local government election, drive a government delivery process, and then say, we've got to achieve the outcomes that are before us?
And speaking of that local government, you're already in partnerships with the EFF in some of those key metros. But surely at national level, it's going to be a little bit trickier to work with the EFF, because at national government you would need to agree on some key programs. For example, the EFF has this non-negotiable 7 cardinal pillars. It includes land expropriation without compensation, which you don't agree with. Are you saying then that any party that you're going to sit down with and agree to work with in 2019, they have to agree to those with those sort of programs and the issues that you just mentioned?
Well, I think let's understand a few things here. When we talk about even the conversation around land, we're very clear about the fact that land must be expropriated. There must be land reform. There must be the empowerment of citizens through title deeds. The key distinguishers are, if you say it's without compensation, then how does that violate the very constitutional provision as given in Section 25? We're saying if you're going to expropriate land, it must be done in consistency with the Constitution itself. And we are adamant about that issue. Because once you get into a process that amends the Constitution, you then will require the 2/3 majority, and I'm uncertain that a coalition could achieve a 2/3 majority. So what is doable within that framework? And so far, we've shown that even amongst farm communities, you've started to create equity schemes that are in fact benefiting South Africans who are working on the farms. When it comes to even state-owned enterprises, can you create a share ownership mechanism that allows more people, particularly black South Africans, to be owners in that space? When it comes to government land, even at this point in time, we are having a big debate about government land that has not been expropriated for public good. How do we ensure that those assets are then transferred rapidly so that we can bring that clause of public good? How do we ensure that when you are talking urban communities, that more South Africans are able to own their land? Because when you go to communities, people don't own. How do you ensure that when you talk about site and service in the land that people live in, that in fact people have ownership? And lastly, when we talk about expropriation for public good, then we've done that before. This is not a question that's debatable. It's about saying you are clear that it's within the legal confines of the Constitution. Because once you take away the Constitution, anybody can rise up, and before we know it, any land can be expropriated.
Are you saying then the EFF would need to compromise if you were to sit with them in 2019 to have a talk around coalition government, to compromise on some of their policies?
Any negotiated coalition is always a compromise. Always about different people coming together to find a common goal. And I'm saying the goals must be around those 5 or 6 issues that I've articulated earlier on, because those South Africans can experience and tangibly live through. And if we can agree on a government program, that must be the focus. And in the short term, I want to say to South Africans, it must become critical that they must come out and vote, because actually we must vote for change. And that's why I'm saying the DA, our project is to create that alternative. And at this point in time, our mission is to maximize the votes that South Africans can come out and vote, because the bigger you are, the bigger the say you have, and the bigger you are, the more you can influence policy.
So the DA would also be willing to compromise, as you say. It's all about compromising coalition.
Any coalition is always about that. Now, we must also recognize that you don't give away your values. We wouldn't suddenly want to be compromising on certain key principles and say, we'll compromise on non-racialism, or we'll compromise on nationalization, because I think nationalization becomes a program that has, in the SADC region, shown that it hasn't worked. You can go to Venezuela and look at some of the programs there and see the economic models that have been adopted there and see what outcomes they've had. So I think we mustn't say everything is up for grabs.
But the DA already agrees with the ANC on a number of programs. I mean, the NDP, a market-based economy. Would you consider going into a coalition with the now ruling party?
Look, when it comes to members of the ANC, I think we wouldn't work with the ANC in its entirety as it stands now, because I think some of what unites it is Smolanyana skeletons. What we've got to do is say, could there be structures that are willing to work with us to ensure that ultimately we can achieve that government program? And so long as there are people and individuals who say, we see the way forward, we can work with them.
What do you mean by structures?
In other words, I'm uncertain what's going to happen at the ANC's Congress at the end of the year. You may very well find there might be a breakaway party. And then in that instance, the negotiations will be different. But I will not be working with an ANC that has the continuous views on Jacob Zuma, that wants to defend corruption, that wants to marginalize society on the basis of race. We will never be a part of that.
I mean, there's also sort of what's seen as this emerging slate in the ANC, emerging anti-Zuma slate in the ANC that includes the Deputy President, Minister Lindiwe Sisulu, you've got Mcebisi Jonas, you've got Enoch Kotongwana and the Secretary General, Gwede Mantashe and others. Is this, if this was to be a slate that comes out of the 2019, out of the conference in December, the elective conference of the ANC, are these the people that you'll be willing to sit down with?
We have to be clear what their program is. We have to be clear what they're wanting to do, so long as we share values. But at the end of the day, whilst the ANC is in government, I still maintain that we're better off removing them, because there's a fault in when people say the ANC is salvageable. We have just now inherited governments. It wasn't Jacob Zuma who stole money in places where we are now in government. It was other people. So corruption has become the cancer that has worked itself through the ANC. And it would be wrong of me to legitimize that. So long as that remains the vehicle and the process that the ANC is engaged with, I would say at this point in time, we'd never be able to be party to the advancement of that, because it would be dangerous. And I think the very same individuals you are referring to, some of them have come and voted in support of Jacob Zuma. Now it requires that if there was the courage of their convictions, and I respect many of the people you've listed in that list, because I've worked with some of them, but we're clear that if they were to form the appropriate structure, break away, and we could come around policy, we could work our way forward.
We already know what their views are about the president. They've been against corruption. They've been speaking a lot against corruption. They also want to start on a clean slate.
They've made their views in public. It's not the first time I've heard that. You know, I can use someone like Jackson Mthembu, stood up, made statements publicly, came to parliament, voted to defend the president. Now, which do you trust? The words of a man or their actions? And in this instance, I've seen their actions.
Just last week, your predecessor, Helen Zille, warned the party against becoming green and purple to try and appeal to more voters. In fact, I think I'm going to quote her. She says, quote, "The DA must not sift its principles in the quest for power by cozying up with parties that do not share its liberal sensibilities." You are already cozying up with parties that don't share your liberal sensibilities, the EFF. Would you agree?
When you go into coalition negotiations, I think even Helen Zille would understand the fact that when she took over as mayor of Cape Town, there was a coalition government, even with parties like the Pan-Africanist Congress. There were a broad range of coalitions. Now, when you fight for principle, you've got to say to yourself, what remains core to you as the business? I've never deterred away from a market-based economy. I've never deterred away from non-racialism as a principle. I've never deterred away from constitutionalism and the rule of law. I've never deterred away from the rights of individuals so that they can self-identify. So, without doubt, we'll continue to fight for that. And nowhere where we're governing today have we, in fact, moved away from principle. We've governed for the people. We've wanted to make sure that South Africans who are at home understand fundamentally that government is always for them and it serves them. So I think it would be a wrong diagnosis to say that. And we are working to ensure that the DA offers that alternative for many more South Africans.
I don't know if she's come up and sort of given her views around the coalition government that the DA has in the different key metros with the EFF, because it seems when he speaks about cozying up with parties that don't share the liberal sensibilities, and the first thing I think of is the EFF, because of, I mean, I remember Malema has spoken about how we're not calling for the slaughter of white people just yet, and the EFF called that hate speech. Are you saying that would be the right diagnosis if she believes that by going into partnership with the EFF, it is, of course, that cozying up that she speaks about?
I think what would be wrong to say is that we've never formed a coalition with the EFF. They would not even themselves say they're in a coalition with the DA. They've simply given the mandate, and they act as an opposition party. They act as an opposition party even in the governments that we're in. They simply helped elect the very mayors in place. The coalition agreements was with parties that you've seen the coalition document that we put on the table, with parties that we negotiated a government program to go forward. So the job of saying that we've signed a coalition agreement with the EFF would be a misdiagnosis. At this point in time, we have an agreement with political parties to say, how do we achieve service delivery for the people? How do we ensure that there's no corruption? How do we ensure that, in fact, we don't advance issues around racism? And those parties have agreed. That's why we would never sign. It's not just the EFF in this instance, but there are other parties who don't share those particular values, who we never, when we negotiated, wanted to enter into a coalition discussion with them.
But I want to understand then, does the EFF have a say? I mean, I remember during the time before they helped elect some of your leaders in those key metros, before they lended their votes, the EFF leader said they do have their own sort of conditions that they would want the DA to agree to before they can lend you the votes. I remember with the mayor of Johannesburg, Helen Zille, they said he must really prioritize poor communities. They had other conditions. So how is that partnership different from coalition?
No, it's different in the sense that when somebody says to you they will lend you a vote on the basis of things that you can agree with. They never came, we'd never in any way, if they came to us and said, we'll lend you a vote so that we can invade land illegally, and said, no, that's fine. We'll give away principle of the rule of law so that you can vote for us. And I always made it clear, there is no coalition in this country I'm not willing to walk away from, because the principles are strong. They said they would ask us to focus on the poor. That was, and that's never been the DA's agenda. The DA's agenda has always been about the poor. We spend most of our resources focused on poor communities where we govern. So it was one we could agree on and work going forward. It wasn't anything that we weren't. So these issues are about saying, what are the things that you'd like? I don't think the EFF would sit here today and say we support corruption, or you want us to be corrupt here. So once they come to us and said we oppose corruption, we stand united on that basis and we'll work towards that. That's the job of government.
Do you think you share liberal sensibilities, as Helen Zille says it, with the EFF?
The EFF has its own ideology and agenda. That's why I'm not in a coalition with them. And that's why whenever we agree on anything, it would always be around an issue. We'd never merge parties. We'd never work together to such a point that we suddenly would support nationalization or we support whatever their policies are. I'm saying to them that we have a government program that seeks to advance a market-based economy, an inclusive economy, and the rule of law. EFF, if they want to work with us, it's against those principles that they say, look, we may not agree on everything, but where we can find each other, we can create a program. Now remember, coalitions are not unique in South Africa. They are international by themselves. And all over the world, this is a debate that is taking place. So long as you are crystal clear in your head what the government program is, and retain your identity and your principles as a party on the way.
Now, you have been seen as Helen Zille's protege. I mean, you ascended to power in 2015 with her backing, and I think you previously said that you looked up to her, and so you guys have been closed. She has now defended colonialism. And I remember your tweet, when you responded to that, you said that tweet and that defense of colonialism actually dented the party's efforts to build a non-racial democracy. You must be disappointed in her.
I am. And I said I made it clear. That's why when the tweet came out, I said it is unacceptable. I referred it to a disciplinary committee so that we can take action. She has the right to argue the case within that platform, but I will not in South Africa. I am passionate to want to see South Africans from all walks of life work together, and any action that seeks to not advance that cause, I will take action to. So we were very clear on this issue, and despite I have respect for Helen Zille. I think she's worked and served South Africa. But even in this instance, I think where she's taken action, where I think is inappropriate, I have the right as leader of the DA to then take action against her.
And what has that done to your relationship?
No, I think broadly speaking, I mean, it's always difficult. There's no question about it. But there must come a point where you say to yourself, look, I stand for something, I stand for this particular position, and I want South Africans to work together. So we must then take tough decisions. And it's not easy, like anybody else, but you got to take the decisions.
And I mean, essentially in that tweet, she's saying Africans need to show gratitude to this system that was built on white supremacy. What I'm trying to understand is, how does a leader like that in the DA have a place in this party?
Look, I can't, for process of legal processes, delve into the merits of the case. I can only say, personally, that I'm disagreeable to it. But then, because like anybody, any South African, you might say something that other people want to interpret in different ways. Surely then, you have the right to state your case and be able to say what you were saying. So we must, the power of institutional democracy is that any leader must recognize the fact that I exercise power within a particular framework, and I've got to ensure that once that power is enacted, it safeguards not only the powers of the leader, but also the person whom the leader can act against. Because on another day, you could just simply say the leader can do X, Y, and Z, and you could end up in a place where dictators run from there, where you can simply just say there's no institutional capacity. What I say, what I decide, is simply the way it must go.
I followed you in January last year. I think you were introducing a pledge at the Apartheid Museum that would be signed by members that are joining the DA and returning members. And I think that pledge would require that signatories must uphold the values of the country's constitution, reject discrimination, agree not to perpetuate racial division or undermine the dignity of others. I think you'll agree with me that Helen Zille's tweets actually undermine the dignity of black South Africans.
And I think that matter must be tested. And that's why I've put the charge forward.
Do you agree at a personal level that it did undermine blacks?
I might hold a personal view that says that that tweet was offended me. But ultimately, I want the institutional capacity to take its own action so that we can get to the bottom of it. And I still stand by that stance, and I will always stand by it, because I think anybody, any South African, I wish that pledge must extend to any South African. So all of us must be committed to ensuring that we deal with institutional democracy and we protect the rights of all South Africans.
Are you also feeling the pressure to act and show decisive leadership? I mean, you will agree that the way the party deals with this issue will sort of test its commitment to non-racialism. You will know that there is still a perception out there amongst whether few or more South Africans that the DA is still a party of white, racist people. Surely that tweet also speaks about the reputational damage ahead of the 2019 elections.
There's no question about that. But what I have got to do is also help educate South Africans. To say, when matters like these take place, is there a process that allows itself to be dealt with? Lastly, I think on this particular subject, I've taken the action and it's on its way. And I think we must allow that institutional process to follow its way. I don't think what we must do is also respond to people on Twitter who want to do X, Y, and Z, because you can't be led by people, you must lead in society.
And just lastly on this, I remember the EFF previously said it would be meeting with you. How were the talks immediately after that tweet? Did you meet with the EFF? And how were the talks, if you did?
Look, we didn't meet with the EFF because, as I communicated to them, I said, I don't engage in their own processes. Therefore, I think I needed to be clear what we needed to discuss. And I think, broadly speaking, we've communicated to them the actions we've taken. And I think, overall, we've got to move on from there.
Last year, ahead of the elections, you said you voted for the ANC because it sort of espoused the values of Nelson Mandela. Would you still vote for the ANC if it went back to the values of Nelson Mandela?
No, I think the ANC...
But it seems you're disappointed with the leadership. And not necessarily
I'm not disappointed with it. I'm disappointed with the ANC. I think the ANC is dead. I think what we are seeing now is the carcass of what used to be a great organization. And many South Africans have come through that liberation process, have come through values of Nelson Mandela. But what became clear, somebody once said, that we didn't leave the ANC left us and pursued projects of corruption and state capture. So today, we can't be discussing the ANC. We need to be talking really as South Africans about a post-ANC society. That must be the anchoring discussion. Rather than focused on whether the ANC can be resuscitated or not, I don't believe it can be. I think what we should rather be saying is, we must begin a new journey. We must figure out how government works beyond the ANC. We must be able to say to ourselves, how do we ensure the trajectory moves away from a national liberation movement, that we can safeguard institutions, we can ensure our constitution is safeguarded, the democracy that so many paid for remains a non-racial one, ensure that there's economic prosperity so that more people can find work, and build a nation that works. That is the only discussion, really. To suggest that I really think, along with people like Ahmed Kathrada and many others, we must rather talk about the ANC that used to be, because this is a mafia state run by the kingpin himself. And believe you me, it doesn't matter who they elect at the end of the year. That person is going to continue on the same trajectory because it's become so cancerous in the organization. Our job is now to focus on what do we do for all South Africans and build a nation beyond the ANC, because we mustn't feel that if the ANC is gone, it's the end of democracy. It would be wrong to make that assertion. We must know that the very essence of democracy says power must shift from one party to the next so that we can continue the advances of democracy.